as a person who's pursued these approaches, I find it's easier to talk about than it is to carry out. Because if teachers are engaged in research, and one would argue that in a sense they're involved in continuous experimentation of their teaching, but if they're interested in sort of almost focus, open-ended, systematic examination of their teachers, it's very important for them to be given support. Not the type of support which tells them or prescribes to them what to do, but the sort of support that encourages them to think about what interests them relative to their student learning. Maybe it's important to get them to focus upon the students and their behaviour rather than themselves, lest they become sort of inhibited. And it's important for them to develop trust in their decision making. As I've worked with teachers, it seems too easily, it's too easy to fall into a trap where you're being asked for advice, and very quickly you become a consultant who overrides the teacher's decision making. And so helping teachers develop trust, making sure that teachers empowered in the decision maker, encouraging teachers to look at their classrooms and experiment and think about what's going on, to give themselves feedback with the support perhaps of somebody like myself requires a very different approach to what we've typically done in terms of classrooms, where researchers, again, people like myself, will go in there with a preset package. Working with teachers is much more a form of design work, action research, which is more formative and ongoing in a recursive way over time. Another domain where we've seen sort of forms of activism is a number of researchers have worked with youth. And a recent book put out by Tak and Yang talks about youth resistance research and theories of change. But at UBC, Teresa Rogers, Kerry Winters, Anne-Marie Lamond, and others have been working in the community, engaging people in the use of digital media, particularly in their case, homeless youth and youth in various high schools, to actually use media, again, video media or other digital forms that might be remixed at times, to do cultural critique and to engage with the public in an educative way relative to their interests. Pulling together sometimes films or news releases and other things to challenge the public constructions of what's going on in their communities. In particular with the Rogers and her colleagues' work with youth who are homeless and in high school work. Again, mobilizing a form of activism through digital media that hasn't yet been appropriated by schools, and done in a way of remixing in a fashion sort of befitting with some of the research in artography or semiotics and transmediation, where they're using, in a sense, this artistic form in very creative ways to create meanings which are sometimes jarring, provocative, and educating, in a sense beginning to unite examinations of text in multidimensional transmediated semiotic way with local and global community development. In a similar way, forgot the person's name briefly here. Others have done this work as well. Claudia Mitchell, I apologise, Claudia, and her colleagues have done similar sorts of work with the media among First Nations, with First Nations, where they take the lead, and in South African communities with the South African community there, exploring media as a way to tell their stories, and putting on exhibits and that to invite the public to challenge them about issues that they wish to confront them. Perhaps the work moves towards and includes some form of activism. Perhaps it doesn't go that extra step. But it is interesting how both Mitchell and Rogers sort of set up the frame, set up the circumstances, negotiate that, and get these communities of youth and others on board. There are other studies that also could be looking at movements that have arisen not so much from the frame of the researcher, but from the community themselves. But they are beginning to really reframe education and looking at it in terms of its transformative research and development potential. There is yet another form of transformative work which sort of exists in our everyday lives. To give you an example, as an academic or as an educator or anybody is oftentimes asked to engage in a project. Sometimes those projects, from my perspective, represent a form of transformative research and development. As Dean at the University of Sydney, coming from Canada at that point in time, but as an Australian, I was asked to do an evaluative study of the state of Indigenous education at the University of Sydney with a set of colleagues who were also deans and with the support of some key people who were very good at finding data. From my perspective, I was being asked to do this, and I was interested in doing it from the potential of, well, let's find out where we are and let's see where we want to move. And in a sense, analysing what data we could find to get a sense of the state of Indigenous education, Indigenous student participation and so on at the University of Sydney. Well, when you do work like that, you're not just getting data in an innocent sort of fashion, you really are trying to set up the data collection so it's going to be useful. And it's going to be useful at the units level where the decisions are being made. And so as we pursue this data, we realized that we felt that the unit at which this was going to be made was university-wide, but also separate to each faculty and each degree program. So we asked ourselves questions of, how many students are in the different degree programs within the different faculty. So if you were in medicine, you could actually sort of see, well, this is how many Indigenous students we have. We also wanted to compare that with the national data and to compare it across faculty, so the people in medicine could have a sense of looking at themselves within the university, within the nation. Not just in terms of students getting entry to their program, but students graduating from their program and how long it took, and also how many staff were employed within the university. And who was doing, what was happening to Indigenous education, who was doing research in the Indigenous area, and so on, and how much research was being done. You can sort of see how you might position it. I found it quite stunning because it's not only you positioning it relative to the data you're collecting and making sure you collect data, I would stress over time, so they could sort of see the trend, and you're also doing it in a process. So we were keen to get people involved in sharing with us data and being aware of what we were doing, and then we were keen to share that data with them. Some of the data was quite stunning to people. When you looked at the data over the years, it looked incredibly flat. It didn't look like that you were seeing increases in enrollment of Indigenous students. And if you looked at the data in terms of entry and graduation, sometimes you saw a drop inconsistent with national averages. Indeed, for example, in the Aboriginal teacher education area, we saw that approximately 60 to 80% of the Aboriginal students entering those programs didn't complete their program in 2 or 3 years. We also noticed that, at the University of Sydney, in terms of staff who were hired, there'd been a slight decline. What was stunning, however, I thought, in comparison with this, is there was a lot of research going on in the Indigenous area at the University of Sydney. But when you looked at who was doing the research, it was research being done on Indigenous peoples and not with them or by them. I also remember one thing which was sort of quite stunning. It was I was sitting in a meeting with colleagues from the Faculty of Arts, which was a quite large faculty at University of Sydney, and we shared with them how few Indigenous or Aboriginal academics were part of their faculty. Indeed, in one of the seats near me, I overheard one of the faculty members say to the person next to them, "You know, I'm stunned by this data, how few we have, and the reality is I don't know any of them." And the person next to them sort of said, "Well, you know, I'm one of them." And it was sort of like, whoa. Those sort of occasions, you know, sort of connect you with a sort of a form of research and development that lends itself to optimal moments, but from which you can actually start to develop action plans which are quite transformative. Indeed, as one thinks of critical theory and activism and transformative research and development, one begins to sort of see education moving to a different state of development where researchers are working collaboratively in schools with staff and institutions in support of them and not for their interests. And so one is creating a knowledge system rather than a sort of a knowledge object. And indeed, as you sort of think of critical theory and activism, I find myself ending up asking, what is it about research that we need to do to make it transformative? Whether you're doing positivist research, post-positivist research, constructivist research, or research from a critical frame, that if you approach it from a transformative way, what is the value added for the site, for the participants in the site, relative to the theoretical dispositions and others? I fear that oftentimes more is written in the critical theoretical vein than conducted in the critical theoretical spirit of transformation. Let me move beyond this and wrap up my discussion of research. Obviously, we'll be it's dealt with in various topics. But I'd like to sort of wrap it up by sort of taking you through what I think might be the stages of a research project and thinking about the types of things that one might think about in terms of the dimensions that they need to take into consideration if in fact they're pursuing a research endeavor. It's not meant to be prescriptive, it's not meant to be exemplary, but it will be, I think, illustrative and provide a form of guidelines that will help maybe people think through how they might carry out a research endeavor, leaning towards the transformative side and very much a constructivist orientation. I won't be dealing with research that's sort of tied with random selection of subjects or random assignment. It's much more tied to what I would say is much more a discovery, open-ended mode befitting constructivism and critical theory. Thank you.